The liberal education, what they accuse that often to nowadays is it's not very useful at all. You look at the technical education or the education for professional fields or for crafts that you might receive in a junior college or at universities, and that's useful. But when a person studies philosophy or history or French literature, their fellow students look at them and say, oh, the only thing you can do with that is teach it for other people who will then learn it and teach it again for the next generation. Let's look at the reasoning. You study accounting or engineering. Why? It's useful. It's useful because you can get a big, good job. A big, good job is useful because you can then make a lot of money. Well, that's useful. It's useful because then you can go and buy a big house and get a butler and hire security agents to keep other people away. That's useful because then you can finally have leisure and seclusion and quiet time and come to evaluate, the higher values in life. And those things are not useful for any further purpose. You've reached the end at that point. Well, wait a minute. What if we went right back to the beginning and where you might have chosen the technical fields and gone off with all the useful job and money and house and then quiet and seclusion, and then you're stuck. What do I do with my life? Because I've learned about the metric system or about double entry bookkeeping. Instead, go back to the beginning and choose the liberal arts side. You won't have the money necessarily, and you won't have the big job and the prestige. You may not have the big house, but you may come much more quickly to the point that you want to come to and even pass where the accountant did, because you will have studied the values in life. What is life about? And listened to the great thinkers of the world and made that final step of being part of that great conversation in our Western civilization. Philosophy, an essential part of the well-educated person. We've talked about the fact that it can be broken into three major areas: metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Metaphysics talks about what is the nature of this universe. Is it meaningful or meaningless? Is there cause and effect? Or is it purely random in its effects? The second part, epistemology, talks about how do we get to know this world. Whether we can find it out at all, skepticism says no, or whether we are given that knowledge by revelation, or whether we obtain it through our senses and then think about it. Right, rational cognition is a method. The kind of topics that would be in epistemology would be things like, for example, certainty or chance. When I learn something, anything, through revelation, through my own senses, how certain can I be that that thing is true? Do I believe, for example, in that I have a stomach? I put food, it goes down there somewhere. Other people have had autopsies and they have stomachs. There's much case that almost every human being, if not every human being, does. Do I have one? And that's a question of certainty in my epistemology. My how do I know and what do I know? Faith, another question or topic in epistemology. Or language. When we talk and use language, Is what I think equivalent to what I say? Is what I say equivalent to what you hear? And is what you hear translate into thoughts that are somehow like what I said? Language, the fun one I enjoy is, all right, read out loud the sentence that's now up on the screen. Now read aloud this sentence on the screen. If you were talking over the telephone and just said those things out of context and had the other person write the sentence down, would they get the right sentence? That's part of the questions of epistemology. In science and measurement are questions of epistemology. Measurement, oh, everybody knows how to measure, but if I've got a pizza and they say measure it, and I get out a ruler and I measure it, and I come up with 12 inches across as its diameter, is the pizza 12 inches? Well, we know it isn't exactly 12. That's epistemology. How do I know? What can I know? Is it between 11 and 13 inches? Most probably. But for sure, how often will it be between there when I report that it's 12? Or when a person who takes more care in measuring measures and says 12, then how often will that person have it between 11 and 13 inches? It's questions, many details, but those details are parts of what comes up to the real questions of philosophy that we have in the questions of how we shall live. Science is important. It's really important in today's life more than it has been in the previous centuries. And it is really important to be able to detect the difference between real science and phony science. There exists so much science in the world today that it is difficult for even an educated layman to know all there is to know about science that a person should know. But we must learn at least a little bit so we can detect the phony. To detect the difference between serious science and science in a white smock. Have you heard of the greenhouse effect? Global warming? Well, who hasn't? It's been drilled into us by the TV, by the radio, in the schools, the government schools especially, and magazines everywhere. Global warming. Now, is it serious science, or is it that ideology dressed in a white smock? Did you know that 20 years ago, the environmentalists were all concerned about the coming ice age? They were screaming about it. It was in the headlines of newspapers. It was on the front covers of magazines. Ice age, we're cooling off. Fear. Now what are they wringing their hands about? Pah! It's getting too warm. So when the book came out, Earth in the Balance, by the then Senator Albert Gore, Democrat from Tennessee. In that book, Albert Gore describes global warming as, quote, are you ready? The most serious threat that we have ever faced. I wonder if he's trying to sell his book. Another non-scientist, Bill Moyers, on the dust jacket of Gore's book, intones the following. In this eloquent and unusual memoir of discovery, Al Gore faces honestly the unremitting evidence of science, end quote. Oh, come on. Pony poop. Al Gore and Bill Moyers aren't scientists. Globally, the planet, our planet, has warmed less than 1 degree Fahrenheit in the past century. So states Thomas Carl, research meteorologist at the National Climatic Data Center. And there are many more individuals, reputable scientists, who would agree with those numbers. They say that the CO2 gas, carbon dioxide gas, is driving the temperature up. Well, it isn't. In fact, we get this kind of seesaw effect of going up and down, which are the normal climatic variations in temperature that are part of our planet Earth. Look at the following data. In 1860 to 1910, in those 50 years, we lost about 1/5 of a degree in temperature globally. 1910 to 1938, we had an increase of about a degree. 1938 to 1970, we decreased about 1/2 a degree. In 1970, we zigzagged back up to 1970 to 1990, zigzagged back up to an increase, another 1/2 a degree. Does that look like, well, if CO2 gas, if industry, if culture, scientific culture, were driving this temperature up, it wouldn't be zigzagging like that. Why all of these warnings for global ice age coming or global warming coming? I submit that there are political reasons why these warnings inundate the lay public. Books, literature, drama, nonfiction, poetry, wonderful world, an essential world. Erasmus liked books. Like virtually every well-educated person, he could hardly live without them. He once wrote, "When I get a little money, I buy books. If any is left, I buy food and clothes." Books are much cheaper now than they were in the days of Erasmus. Education, if it is to be a real education and not a sham one, must be centered in reading. In reading the great texts. Abraham Maslow was one of this century's foremost psychologists and philosophers. He died in 1970, in June of 1970, and he wrote, "The final and unavoidable conclusion is that education must be concerned with its final values. What is the good life? What is the good man, the good woman? What is the good society? What is best for my children? What is justice, truth, virtue? What is my relation to death, to nature, to death, to aging, to pain, to illness? How can I live a zestful, enjoyable, meaningful life? What must I be ready to die for?" These questions of Maslow are questions that are very important if you want to live a full, real life. And those questions can't be answered without a context, without reading the great literature, the items of literature, the great texts. When Maslow asks about truth and justice, do you look to Claude Van Damme? You know, is that where you find the answer? If Maslow asks, how can I live a meaningful life? Do you watch Roseanne to get the answer? What must I be ready to die for? Is that answered by listening to Clinton? Because Maslow died in June of 1970, shall we no longer listen to him? The great minds and the great voices of, say, the last 25 centuries can be ours for the reading. Last time we were talking about Euclid's Elements, the book that was written about 300 BC by Euclid, an all-time bestseller. A fellow named William Dunham, who wrote Journey Through Genius, had this to say about Euclid's Elements, one sentence. It has been said that of all the books from Western civilization, only the Bible has received more intense scrutiny than Euclid's Elements. It's an important book. Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, one of the important philosophers of this century, along with being a mathematician and several other things that he was importantly involved with. He died in 1970. He wrote in his autobiography, at the age of 11, I began Euclid with my brother as tutor. This was one of the great events of my life, as dazzling as first love. When I was in high school, the book that we studied geometry out of, was patterned very much directly after Euclid, in translation, of course. He wrote in Greek. But we were using the same initial postulates and axioms that Euclid used at that time, and proving the theorems much in the same way that was written in the Elements. What made Euclid special in his book, The Elements, was that he specifically elected to write from a starting point. In everyday life, when you're having a discussion with someone else, it's important that you have these common assumptions that you can start with. If A thinks, for example, that the state is the most important thing, more important than the individual, and individual B thinks that the individual has God-given inalienable rights over which the state cannot trample. Then when it comes to be discussing between A and B, anything with regard to the government, for example, and its taxes that it now currently has, which are used to support the growing of tobacco. A and B are starting from different points of view, and there's little hope of reaching a common conclusion. Euclid starts with 23 definitions and 5 postulates and 5 what he called general axioms of thought. And from there, he weaves out in his 13 books of the Elements a masterpiece that with this starting point that we all agree on, and I'll discuss that next time what the starting points are, we avoid a circularity in reasoning so that we don't start with A and prove B and then B proves A again, but we go just in a straight line. Time magazine did a survey of 8 leading intellectuals. And this secular magazine reported that 5 of those 8 individuals considered the Bible to be one of the 5 essential books that any truly educated person should read. And that quote is around truly educated in Time magazine's own words. Samuel Taylor Coleridge wrote, "It finds me, the Bible finds me, at greater depths of my being than any other book." When we speak of the salt of the earth, a labor of love, a drop in the bucket, the valley of decision, the apple of the eye, a wolf in sheep's clothing, a house divided against itself, sweeter than honey. Those words, those phrases are from the Bible. The Bible has had a profound influence on our culture. Whether you're a Christian or a non-Christian, if you are to understand the cultural context in which you live today, then it's essential that you read the Psalms of David, or the matchless 55th chapter of Isaiah, or the incomparable parables of Jesus, and the love story of Ruth, and the Apocalypse of John, which has the 4 horsemen in it. In Peter Tasker's book, The Japanese, and in Shotaro Ishimura's book, Japan Incorporated, we learn about how hard the Japanese are working. The mid-level executives, we are told, start their day at their desk at 9 in the morning. That doesn't sound too bad at all. Until we read that they often stay there at their desks until 8 p.m., 6 days a week. And if that's not enough, when it comes time for them to have their annual vacations, many of them volunteer to stay at work instead of going on vacation. They are challenged in what they're doing. Work doesn't kill them. And in fact, they are consistently outliving us Americans. To use the old-fashioned word, zest is what they experience in their life and in their work. Exhilaration. And it's true for almost every other developed country in the world. But most of us Americans are human. And perhaps all of us Americans are. American kids too. And the natural instinct is to exert ourselves as little as possible. We go to our jobs or to our schools and put in the minimum. And after that's over with, we head off somewhere to relax, as if that's what we really needed. But every once in a while we meet someone who is really excited about what they're doing, stimulated up to the eyeballs, always thinking about, always talking about their projects with whomever they meet, working on it long after the rest of us have gone home. Well, part of being well educated is to read the biographies, the lives of people who have been really excited about something. To learn that the pain associated with that excitement is well worth it. To understand from those biographies that life that is dedicated to minimum effort, minimum pain, minimum vision, is a life that will be without zest and meaning.